everyone, Clio here, and it's time to wrap up the month of October. So the month of October is in a way my worst reading month so far. I think in terms of like page count, it's probably not the worst one, but in terms of the amount of books read, it is the lowest amount of books that I read this month. So I ended up finishing 7 books only, I think, this month. So that means that this wrap-up is going to be super short because I have also done a mid-month wrap-up. But as always, I'm also going to go into the haul section for this month, so to balance out my reading month, to see whether I've been reading more than I've been purchasing, and that is actually the main goal that I'm striving for. So more important than the amount of books that I'm reading is definitely the fact that I want to be making a dent in the physical TBR that I have. But so without further ado, let's dive into this wrap-up. So if you want to hear me talk about the first 5 books that I read this month, then please head on over to my mid-month wrap-up that I will link up above. So if you want to hear me talk about Disability Visibility by Alice Wong, about Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje, The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien, or if you want to hear me talk about Get Alive, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. All of those you can find in my mid-month wrap-up for this month. But so for the second half of this month, I basically only read 2 more books. I tried to read a third one, but that one isn't finished yet, so I'll be carrying that one over into the month of November. But so the first one that I finished in the second half of the month of October is Little Eyes by Samantha Schweblin. So this book is originally published in Spanish. This is the English translation which came out this year. So it is a book in which we are kind of looking at the sort of consequences of technologies and of like our relationship as mankind with technology itself, and the way in which we kind of jump onto these new hypes, jump onto new technologies without really taking into account the fact that they might be very invasive to our privacy, without looking at these sort of consequences for privacy, for our relationships with other people, for the relationship with the technology, the way that that technology is going to impact our lives, and also without really waiting for a proper like legal framework to arise, because like legal framework is always running behind these sort of new technologies, trying to make sure that they are handled safely, but there's always this sort of like there's always this sort of like early time period in which the technology has come out but the legal framework isn't there yet. But so in Little Eyes we are following a host of people who all have bought or purchased a connection to a Kentucky. Now Kentucky are these sort of like new robots type pets that come in all sorts of varieties. So the panda is pictured here, but there's also like dragons, moles, ravens. There's all sorts of animal forms to the Kentucky itself. And you can either be the person who owns a Kentucky and so has the Kentucky at their place, or you can be the person behind the Kentucky, because the Kentucky is basically a camera. So it is watching its owner, and there is somebody on the other side watching that person. So it's a lot about the way in which there's a difference between people who want to watch, people who want to be the one who is being watched, but also the way in which people have different relationships to this Kentucky. So some people really try to dehumanize the Kentucky and just see it as a sort of pet that they have in the house, a pet that cannot talk back, a pet that doesn't have any sort of personality to it, any sort of identity to it. And then there are other people who really want to figure out like who is on the other side of that camera, and who really want to strike up a bond with the person on the other side. There's actually also somebody who like has a connection to Kentucky, but then later on will also get her own Kentucky. So it's a very interesting concept, and I very much like the way it looked at mankind's relationship to technology. And because the backbone of the story is definitely that while we are looking at this sort of imagined situation, at a technology that doesn't really exist yet at this point in time, it does also say a whole lot about the way that we interact with technology at this point of our lives, and the way in which we don't really think about the security aspect of all of these things. And there are some interesting stuff going on in here. There's some interesting, we're mostly following a couple of bigger perspectives, but from time to time we'll also have a short one in there that is kind of there to showcase some of the like more horrific stuff that can happen with the Kentucky. And while this is not like what I personally like a whole lot is a collection of like short stories or a collection of different perspectives that all come together in the end. This is not doing that, this book. So if you go into that expecting that, then you might be disappointed. So do know that there are a lot of different perspectives, but you don't see them match up. For example, I was kind of expecting at the beginning that some of the people who own the Kentucky and some of the people who were being watched, that we were going to form some links there at some point, but that is not the way that this story works. But I do definitely think that the book manages to round off in a very satisfying way. You know, the final chapter that we get does manage to like switch to turn the tables on the person who we are following in that chapter, and to kind of horrify that person, because that person has made certain assumptions about the Kentucky, about who is behind the Kentucky, and those assumptions will really be like turned on their heads in that final chapter. So I definitely enjoyed this one a whole lot, but it was a little bit scattered because of the multiple perspectives and because of, you know, them not coming together. I do think that all the perspectives have enough in common to, because of the central theme of the Kentucky, to keep this as one whole. However, I would have liked a little bit more of interconnectivity perhaps between some of those perspectives, and so because of that it lands at like a 4-star for me, I think, but I do definitely think it's a very interesting one to read. And then the final book that I read this month is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Brönte. So I read this because October is always a Victober, which is a read-along that is hosted by a couple of people on BookTube. I mainly know of it through Lucy the Reader, and as the name of the read-along clearly indicates, this is a read-along in which we are reading Victorian literature in the month of October. I only read one this time around. I didn't read any, I think, last year, so I'm already happy that I was able to participate at least at some point. So The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is a book by Brönte, which is one of the 3 Brönte sisters. She is, in my opinion at least, the lesser known Brönte. I think a whole lot of people end up reading Jane Eyre. Some others also read Wuthering Heights, but I think there are relatively few who end up reading The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. A few people who end up reading Brönte, and that's really quite a shame, because I do definitely think that there's a lot of merit to The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. I wouldn't say it was a 5-star read or anything like that, but it was a very pleasant surprise and I absolutely enjoyed my time with it. Basically, the story is told from a perspective of a man living in a sort of small town in England, and one day a woman and her son move into Wildfell Hall. And so a lot of speculation arises in the neighborhood. A lot of people instantly get a dislike for Mrs. Graham, I think her name is. A lot of people instantly dislike her because she has some very strong opinions, and she ruffles some furs in the first times that they meet up with her. They definitely think that she is overprotective of her son. And while our protagonist originally also feels that way about her, he will start to grow very attached to her. And through his sort of interactions with her, we will get to the story within the story, which is an account of Mrs. Graham's past and how she ended up in that community. I think it's a very groundbreaking book, because basically it's a book written in the 19th century about a woman who abandons her man, a woman who abandons her husband to set out for herself, to live her own life, to protect her child. So it's something that I would be super interested in figuring out, like, what the contemporary reception to this book was, because I'm going to assume that this was very much a divisive book at its time, and maybe even a hated book at its time. You know, I'm not entirely sure that a whole lot of females would even have a positive reception to a book like that, because of the whole emphasis of, you know, obeying your husband through and through that was there at that time. But so Mrs. Graham is a very interesting character, because she's a woman who fell madly in love with basically sort of rake during her youth. She was cautioned about staying away from him by her aunt. Her aunt was like, he is not who you think he is. He isn't the sort of like innocent, lovable boy that you see in him. He has a very bad reputation. And while she was aware of some of his bad behaviors, she was very much convinced that her love for him, and his love for her would carry him through, would reform him. And throughout this book we will see that she comes to understand that she can never reform her, and that she can never reform him, and that marrying him was like a big mistake in her life because it means that she's kind of tied up to him. She cannot abandon him, she cannot leave him because it is her duty to stay with him. And while at first she has very much difficulties, at first she's very much not admitting to the fact that marrying him was a mistake, I think definitely towards the latter half of her life with him, she definitely comes to understand that she shouldn't have married him, and she's also cautioning somebody else to avoid marrying somebody who she doesn't know well enough. I think it's a very interesting one, but I definitely do think that the structure sometimes works against it. So the frame story that we start off with and that we end up with is told as a epistolary novel, meaning that we're always reading from a hindsight perspective and always reading in a very presentable way. And then the story within the story is more or less written in the same way, but it's like journal entries. And so as a result, I feel like the story feels a little bit too passive, a little bit too much like a reflection on what has happened. And therefore the text ended up not being as engaging as it could be, and I think it would have really merited to be a little bit more engaging because of the content that is in there. However, maybe it was already shocking enough in the way that it's presented now and would have maybe riled the emotions of 19th century public a little bit too much if it was told in a different way. So yeah, it's definitely an extremely interesting book considering at what time it was written, and I definitely think that I would like to see more attention go to the reception of this book, for example, or to the role of this book in the advancements of female positions in society, for example. I would like to know what impact this book had on certain feminist themes, for example. So I definitely did enjoy reading this book, and I'm very happy that I finally got around to it. And I do definitely want to read more Anne Brönte, because while I do think that the structure of it didn't always work to its benefit, I did definitely still enjoy my time through it. It was maybe a little bit too, like, the character of Mrs. Graham is a little bit too pedagogical, I guess, in some point. She's a little bit too... She has strict morals, and that can feel a little bit like she's preachy from time to time, which is obviously what is off-putting about her at the beginning of the book for some of the other characters. And as a modern reader, that can also sometimes feel a little bit like that, but you do get to more of the depth of her character within the central part of this novel. And that is also kind of my concern with the structure, is that it's just a little bit too split within those two time periods, rather than having them be integrated a little bit more in some sort of a way. So you definitely do feel like this is two novels put into one, because you start off in its present day time period, let's call it like that, and then you have like maybe even 200 pages of this journal entry of her explaining her past. So it does definitely feel like we are switching around for long periods rather than having the two time periods integrated into one, as we would have in a more modern day novel. So if a writer would tackle a story like this at this point in time, they would kind of intersperse the two narratives a little bit more. And yeah, I'm a little bit more used to that. I'm also feeling like that works a little bit better. But of course that's a little bit of a stylistic thing that perhaps at that time was never really done, and so that she also didn't really think of the possibility of presenting it in that way. But so yeah, that would be my reading for the month of October. In terms of books hauled, I basically only hauled one book. So I've been very, very good in the month of October. But so the one book that I did buy this month is Piranesi, which, as I said at the beginning of this video, is in my mid-month wrap-up, so I already read it as well at this point. So that means that I purchased one book, which I also already bought, so that doesn't really count. But so I purchased one book and I read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 physical books that aren't rereads, because the Fellowship of the Ring was a reread. So that means that I have a progress of 4 books down for my physical TBR, which is not enough in terms of my goals by the end of the year, but it's already some progress, so I'm already happy in that sense. I think that in terms of like reading my physical TBR this year, I will miss that goal, but I'm definitely also planning an on-haul in December, which will definitely fix that problem as well, I'm thinking. So yeah, that has been my reading month. So it's been a little bit more of a slow month. I've not felt like reading for a big chunk of the month as well. I think it's definitely due to the fact that I just was overworked at work, and so in the evenings I just felt like light entertainment like TV or playing The Sims a whole lot and things like that. So I should have definitely actually just switched to audiobook a bit more and just gone for some lighter audiobook reads to go along with these. But I was so adamant for some reason to read the books that were on my pile of possibilities this month, even though I know my pile of possibilities is flexible. That's the whole goal behind the pile. But sometimes I just get too caught up in it because I want to read all of them, that I don't want to switch over to other books. But I should have probably done that. That would have still landed me at a more like positive numbers. But in any case, it's not the amount of books that you read that matters. I'm definitely happy to, from time to time, just read a little bit less if that means that if I need to, if my mental health benefits from that. So let's see what happens in the month of November, and in any case, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this one. Definitely let me know down below if you've read any of these books, because I would definitely love to talk to you guys about them and how your reading month has been. So yeah, see you guys for the next one. Bye!